Hi, I'm Silas. She laughed in court, mocking that I couldn't even come up with $1,000 for a lawyer. My wife, the woman I built a life with. While I stood there alone, she looked the judge dead in the eye and said I was irrelevant, powerless, broken, and for a long time. Maybe I was. But what she didn't see, what no one saw, was everything I'd rebuilt in silence. They stripped me of pride, twisted the truth, and left me with nothing but my own voice. And with just one calm answer, everything changed. So, what did I say? And why did the entire courtroom go dead silent when I said it? You'll find out. But first, let me take you back to the moment they thought I'd already lost. The courtroom was quieter than I expected. Not silent, but subdued in a way that made every small sound feel amplified. The scrape of a chair leg against the floor, papers sliding across polished wood, the faint buzz of the overhead lights. The air smelled like old files and disinfectant, a mix that reminded me of places where people waited to be judged. I sat alone at my table, no briefcase at my feet, no lawyer leaning in to whisper strategy, just me, a legal pad I'd brought out of habit, and my hands folded together to keep them still. I wasn't nervous in the way people imagine, no racing heart, no shaking knees. It was something heavier than that. Awareness. The kind that settles into your shoulders when you know everyone can see exactly where you stand. Across the aisle, my wife sat with her attorney. She looked relaxed, almost comfortable, as if this were a meeting she'd already rehearsed and won in her head. Her lawyer murmured something to her, and she smiled in that familiar way, polite on the surface, sharp underneath, the way she smiled when she knew she had the upper hand. The room felt small then, not because of its size, but because of the way status filled it. Who belonged where? Who had support? Who didn't? I reminded myself why I was there alone. The separation hadn't been dramatic. No shouting match, no slammed doors. Just a slow tightening of finances and patience until something finally gave. When I moved out, I took what fit in the back of my car and left the rest because it seemed easier than arguing over furniture. Bills came faster after that. Rent, groceries, keeping the lights on. I wasn't careless with money. I was careful to the point of exhaustion. Hiring a lawyer hadn't been an option then. Not because I didn't understand the importance, but because survival came first. You choose food over representation. You choose stability over appearances. That's not irresponsibility. That's reality. The judge hadn't entered yet when it happened. My wife leaned slightly forward in her chair, glancing toward my empty side of the table. Her voice carried easily in the room, clear, deliberate. "Of course he doesn't have an attorney," she said with a soft laugh that wasn't meant to be kind. "He can't even afford $1,000 for one." The laugh followed. Not nervous, not awkward, confident. A ripple moved through the room. Someone cleared their throat. A man in the back shifted his weight. I caught a raised eyebrow from a woman near the aisle before she looked away. No one said anything. They didn't have to. The moment had landed exactly where it was meant to. I felt the heat rise in my face, not from anger, but from being reduced to a number in front of strangers. $1,000. As if that single figure summed up my worth, my effort, my years of work. I reached into my wallet then. The leather was worn, soft from use. Inside, tucked behind an old receipt, was a small folded piece of paper. I slid it out carefully. On it, written in my own handwriting, was $1,000. I didn't look at it long. I folded it once, then again. smaller, neater, until it fit back where it belonged. My hands were steady. I didn't say a word. The judge entered moments later, calling the room to order. Everyone stood. Everyone sat. Procedure resumed as if nothing had happened, but the echo of her laughter stayed with me, hanging in the air like unfinished business. My wife leaned back, satisfied. She didn't look my way again. She didn't need to. In her mind, the story was already written. I was the man who couldn't keep up. The man who came unprepared. The man defined by what he couldn't pay. No one asked me anything yet. No one needed my side. Not at this stage. I watched, listened, waited. Silence has a reputation for being empty, but I've learned it can be full of intention if you know how to use it. I didn't come here to perform. I came here to finish something. I glanced at her once more. She was smiling faintly, eyes forward, already counting a victory she thought was guaranteed. She thought this hearing was about money. She had no idea how wrong she was. She thought the amount defined me. It didn't. The judge's gavel tapped gently, and the room shifted, not in noise, but in posture. People sat a little straighter. The bailiff took a step forward. A subtle change in air pressure, like a storm trying to pass without thunder. No one looked at me. Not directly, anyway. A few glanced past me, polite but distant, the way you do when you pass someone struggling to pay at the grocery store and pretend not to see. I could feel the judgment floating in that silence, thin, passive, but real. No one stepped in. They didn't need to. The damage had already done its work, and it didn't need a crowd to echo it. That's the thing about public embarrassment. It rarely comes with a rescue party. I watched my wife lean toward her lawyer, whisper something I couldn't hear, then lean back like she had just brushed a fly off her sleeve. Her face said it all, that smug blend of pity and triumph. She'd landed her punch. In her mind, the game was already over. Her attorney didn't even hide his assumption. He began organizing papers on the table like this was a formality now. A short walk through a door that had already been opened. And from their angle, I probably looked done. No representation, no rebuttal, no raised voice or righteous anger. Just a man sitting there with nothing in his hands but folded fingers and quiet eyes. In a place like this, silence isn't just misunderstood. It's branded. People read it as surrender. But silence, for me, has never meant retreat. I'd had years to get familiar with it. After the separation, when the house no longer echoed with arguments or excuses, silence became my company. I worked. I paid down debt. I studied contracts, rental agreements, credit reports. Not because I had to, but because I was tired of being the one who always trusted while someone else maneuvered. That folded paper in my wallet, with $1,000 scribbled on it, wasn't a reminder of what I lacked. It was a marker of how far I'd come. Years ago, I'd have lashed out when mocked like that. Now I just folded it again. I wasn't interested in telling anyone my plans. I didn't owe them that. The judge looked over their glasses at me. A pause, then a question, basic, procedural, something about confirming my understanding of the documents filed. I answered clearly. Steady voice, no anger, just fact. There was a flicker there, behind the bench. Not approval, not yet, but attention, a recalibration. It didn't last long, but I caught it, and she didn't. My wife was back to flipping through a folder, smiling faintly, like she was watching a slow movie she already knew the ending to. She leaned back again, relaxed, as if the worst part of her day was done. A short recess was called. Just 15 minutes, but long enough to step outside the suffocating quiet of that room. I walked into the hallway, empty but for the hum of vending machines and a bulletin board cluttered with announcements no one read. There was a narrow glass panel near the elevator. I caught my reflection there. Older. A little grayer than I remembered. The lines around my eyes deeper. Not from age, but from holding in more than I ever let out. I wasn't the man she remembered. Not the man who panicked when the account dipped, not the man who once begged to keep the house, and definitely not the man who'd walk into a courtroom today without knowing exactly what he was doing. I reached for my wallet, but didn't take out the paper this time. I just touched it. That was enough. I made a quiet choice standing there. I wouldn't explain my past to anyone. No more apologies for surviving on less. No more justifications for the way I rebuilt. I wasn't going to defend myself. I was going to show them who I'd become. The bailiff called us back in. I walked behind the others. No rush. My wife was already at the table when I returned. She smoothed her skirt, adjusted a paperclip on the stack in front of her, never once looking my way. I sat down across from her, slowly, on purpose. This was the last moment anyone in that room would mistake my quiet for absence. They still thought I had nothing to say. They were about to find out how wrong that assumption was. The courtroom doors had barely closed behind us when the judge resumed her seat, flipping through a thick stack of notes. The quiet shuffle of papers and low murmurs returned like background noise, as if no one expected anything to change. Just more of the same: motions, objections, agreements, signatures. My wife's lawyer stood with the calm authority of someone who'd walked this path 100 times. He started speaking smoothly, guiding the judge through a well-organized folder of exhibits and statements. "Your Honor," he began, "as previously noted, Mr. Rowan has not provided financial support in a consistent manner over the last several years. Records show gaps in income, irregular deposits, and no clear proof of sustained employment. This pattern," he paused, letting the word land, "suggests instability and a lack of capacity to provide." I kept my eyes steady, not reacting. Just listening. It was a tidy narrative. He painted the image of someone who simply couldn't keep up, too disorganized, too overwhelmed, too unprepared. I'd heard versions of it before, whispered behind closed doors, floated in family gatherings like concern. He's not himself these days. I don't think he's handling things well. She's probably better off. What people believe when no one corrects them becomes truth, especially in places like this, where the quiet ones are assumed guilty of being weak. But I stayed silent, hands folded, back straight, because I remembered what those years were actually like. They weren't dramatic. No big turnarounds, no miracle jobs, just long, slow stretches of hard hours, working graveyard shifts hauling freight, missing holidays to pick up double-time pay, watching others climb while I held ground. Rebuilding wasn't heroic. It was exhausting and invisible. No one claps for the man who learns to fix his own credit after it's wrecked. No one cheers when you learn to cook on a budget or patch your own tires because the shop quote was too high. They called those years nothing, but they were everything that kept me from falling apart. The judge turned to me, pen hovering. "Mr. Rowan," she said evenly, "can you confirm when you began working at Harrison Transport?" I nodded. "October 2019, Your Honor. Night crew. I moved to D's in early 2022. Her pen moved. "And you maintained consistent income since then?" "Yes, ma'am. I can provide full records, including tax documents and verified deposits. I brought them with me today. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed my wife glance up. Not long, just a flick of her gaze. It wasn't alarmed. Not yet. But it was the first time she looked at me like she realized I might not be reading from her script. Her lawyer cleared his throat, already flipping to the next section of his outline, but she interrupted him, softly but sharp enough. "Well," she said, "that might be true, but that doesn't account for 2020. There were months when nothing came through." The judge paused, eyebrow lifted slightly. "You'll have your turn to respond, Mrs. Rowan." It was small, barely a twitch in the rhythm, but I saw it. She couldn't help herself. Her certainty cracked, not with a bang, but a slip of control. A woman used to being believed, suddenly unsure what I'd show next. I didn't look at her. Instead, I kept my focus where it belonged, on facts, not feelings. Because the truth is, when you've spent years being told your efforts don't count, it gets under your skin. I'd heard it so many times, in so many ways. That's not real work. Helping with the kids isn't the same as providing, "Yeah, but were you actually contributing?" It's easy to dismiss quiet work when it isn't flashy, but the foundation of every strong house is what you don't see. I wasn't looking for praise anymore. Not from her, not from anyone. I wasn't even angry about it now. I just didn't need to prove anything beyond this room. The judge flipped a page, eyes scanning the documents her clerk handed her. "We'll need supporting paperwork for the next segment," she said. "Mr. Rowan, please submit any evidence you've brought regarding employment, housing, and expenses." Her attorney smiled slightly, confident the story was still his to control. I stayed calm, because this wasn't the part where I broke. They thought this was the part where I fell apart. They had no idea this was where the balance started to shift. The judge didn't say much as she scanned the documents I'd handed over. Her eyes moved from line to line with quiet concentration, but the weight in the room shifted. It wasn't about the paper itself. It was what it represented: order, facts, something other than the storyline that had dominated up to now. My ex-wife sat upright again, one leg crossed neatly over the other, hands clasped like she was gearing up for round two. Her expression was back to neutral, but I saw the slight twitch in her jaw. It was always the first sign. The courtroom had grown quieter in a different way. Not bored, not detached, but watchful, like they could feel something starting to build. Then came the moment she couldn't help herself. The judge hadn't asked her anything. Her lawyer hadn't even shifted in his seat. But she leaned forward, cleared her throat lightly, and launched. "I think it's important to point out," she said, loud enough to rise over the soft hum of paperwork shuffling, "that having documents doesn't mean anything if there's no consistency behind them. I mean, anyone can piece things together when they know they'll be watched." She laughed a little, but it didn't land. I felt the discomfort ripple around the room. Small things. Someone's foot stopping mid-tap, a cough that wasn't followed by another sound. Even her lawyer turned slightly toward her, not stopping her, but not quite agreeing either. "And it's not just about work," she added, her tone climbing. "It's about responsibility. There are things he's never shown up for: school meetings, doctor's appointments. I've carried all of that. You can't measure that with bank statements." She wasn't looking at the judge anymore. She was looking at me, speaking to me, like the courtroom didn't matter, and this was just another living room argument where volume counted more than substance. That's when the judge gently but firmly set down her pen. "Mrs. Rowan," she said, her voice even, "I'll ask that all comments be directed through proper procedure. If your attorney has anything further to add, he'll have the opportunity." It was not a reprimand, not overt, but it was clear. I didn't smile, didn't shift, just stayed still and met my ex-wife's stare like a mirror, offering nothing for her to bounce off of. Her lips pressed into a line, and she sat back. A moment later, the judge turned to me. "Mr. Rowan, would you like to respond to any of the statements made?" My voice was steady. "Yes, Your Honor. I'm prepared to proceed fully." That was all I said, but it was enough. I watched her eyes narrow. Her fingers twitched like she wanted to grab something. Control, maybe. But there was nothing left in reach. Inside, though, I wasn't triumphant. I wasn't trying to win a performance. What I felt, more than anything, was weight. Because I knew what came next wasn't going to be a defense. It was going to be the truth. And truth doesn't come without cost. Once you name something out loud, especially in a place like this, it can't go back to being unspoken. It was the point of no return, not for the case, but for whatever was left of the story we used to tell people about our family. And I had to ask myself, one last time, was it worth it? Yes, it had to be. Because silence hadn't protected anyone. It had only delayed the inevitable. The judge took a breath, reviewed her notes again, and then glanced at the clerk. "We'll schedule continuation of testimony for next Wednesday at 9:30 a.m. Subpoenas will be issued, as discussed." I nodded once. My ex-wife was already gathering her things, too quickly. Then she looked at me, not mocking, not amused, irritated. And I looked right back, calm, level. She could feel the ground shifting, even if she didn't know why. The judge's words were still echoing faintly in my ears as we stepped out into the hallway for a short recess. The room behind us had gone quiet, but out here, the air felt raw, like the silence wasn't relief, but pressure looking for somewhere else to go. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but it was hard not to. She stood 10 feet away with her attorney, arms folded, jaw set in that expression I'd come to know too well. It used to appear when I forgot a grocery list, or when I paused too long before answering a question she already had an answer to. "This next part," she muttered, not caring who heard. "He won't have anything for it. Just watch, he's going to flinch. He always does." Her lawyer gave a small nod, quiet, mechanical. I turned away before I could hear more. That was enough. I walked a bit down the hall, past the water fountain, until I reached a spot near the window where the late sunlight was starting to lean sideways through the glass. I leaned my shoulder against the wall, let it hold me up for a minute, and for the first time all day, I let myself feel tired. Not tired in the bones, but deeper. The kind of tired that creeps in when you know you've already come too far to turn around, but still aren't sure the road ahead leads to anything good. I thought about my son, about what he might hear secondhand from someone's version of this day. If it would be a twisted tale of courtroom drama or just another log tossed into the fire of who hurt who more. And I wondered, for the first time, if maybe this wasn't worth it. What if I just stepped back? What if I took the quiet route, settled, let her have the story, the house, the narrative, let people think what they want? It wouldn't be the first time. I'd kept my mouth shut more times than I could count. At dinners, at school meetings, during holidays that turned into battlegrounds. I'd done it for peace, for keeping things calm, for the hope that my silence would be seen as restraint, not surrender. But the thought clung to me now, like fog. Was I just about to do it again? The temptation was real, heavier than I expected. I looked down at my hands, still folded, still steady, but there was a tension in them I hadn't noticed before, like something inside me was waiting, watching. If I let this go, if I walked back into that courtroom and gave her what she wanted, maybe it would be easier. Maybe it would be quieter. But then I saw it, plain as day. The pattern. Peace had always come at a cost. Mine. Every time I'd stepped back, it had made things easier, for everyone but me. Every time I swallowed the words, every time I let the lie stand, every time I played the fool just to keep someone else comfortable, I'd given up a little more ground, and I was out of ground. That realization hit like cold water down the back of my neck. Not harsh, but sobering. This wasn't about revenge or pride. It wasn't even about proving her wrong. It was about not abandoning myself. Not again. When I turned back toward the courtroom doors, my legs didn't feel lighter. There wasn't a triumphant score playing in the background. No imaginary applause, just the quiet weight of a decision made. The hallway hadn't changed. Neither had the looks from the others standing nearby. But I had. I walked back into the room, not faster, not slower, just with intention, took my seat where I'd been all morning. The same bench, same folder, same silence. But I wasn't retreating anymore. The judge re-entered and called the room to attention. My wife was already standing, papers in hand. "Your Honor," she said, with a confident tone that aimed more for performance than precision, "I'd like to submit additional documents related to financial inconsistencies in the respondent's past filings." The judge motioned for the clerk to collect them. I didn't flinch. I didn't sigh. I just watched. She thought pressure would make me fold. But pressure doesn't break you when you've already lived through worse. The courtroom had cooled since the break, but only in temperature. The atmosphere had turned electric, sharp, humming, waiting for something to happen. Everyone had returned to their seats, but the way people held their pens, the way the judge flipped through papers slower than usual, it all said the same thing. Something was coming. And it did. "My client would like to formally submit a supplemental statement," her lawyer announced, voice polished but eager, like this moment had been circled in red on some calendar no one else could see. "This includes additional context regarding the respondent's prior financial behavior, inconsistencies in reporting, and, respectfully, concerns about his capacity to provide reliable support." The folder passed from hand to hand, bailiff to clerk to judge, and I followed it with my eyes, not moving otherwise. She didn't even look at me. Her back straightened, her shoulders squared, like a performer stepping up to the mic. This was the part she believed would land the final blow. Her attorney continued, citing exhibits, statements, dates, each one framed just close enough to the truth to sound legitimate, and just far enough from the whole picture to be dangerous. I listened, carefully, not to react, but to track. Then she stood up. It wasn't her turn. No prompting. But she stood anyway. "I just feel," she began, loud enough to skip the mic, "that it's important to clarify. This pattern didn't just appear overnight. I've spent years cleaning up behind him. Financially, emotionally, even as a co-parent, when he showed up at all. And the record should reflect that." There it was, the shift from legal argument to moral performance. The courtroom grew quieter, not because she said anything shocking, but because everyone recognized the change. This wasn't professional anymore. It was personal, deeply, nakedly so. The judge gave no response at first, just watched her. Let the words hang like wet laundry in still air. Then, calmly, with a tone that didn't rise above conversational, the judge said, "Mrs. Rowan, we'll have time for full statements during formal testimony. For now, let's proceed with documented facts." Not a scolding, not even a warning, but it landed like a closed door. She sat, blinking once, but the edge of her lip twitched, the only crack she'd shown all day. I kept my hands folded. I didn't move, didn't flinch. Not yet. When the judge turned to me and asked if I had anything to add in response to the submission, it felt like time had paused, not stopped, but tightened. Like someone had turned the volume down just a notch. Not enough to silence, but enough to notice every detail. I cleared my throat once, not to gather courage, I already had that, but to center my voice. "I dispute the accuracy of several points made in that document," I said, "and I'll be submitting my own records to clarify." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't look at her, but I did glance toward the judge, not pleading, not provoking, just meeting the moment. The judge nodded. "You may submit supporting documentation by the end of today's session." That was all. But it was everything, because I hadn't defended myself emotionally. I hadn't gotten pulled into her framing. I hadn't made the mistake of trying to untangle every thread she'd twisted. I just set a stake in the ground. She'd expected me to react, to get loud, maybe even to make a mistake she could use. But when I didn't move, when I answered with precision instead of panic, I saw it land. The judge turned back to his paperwork, but I saw his pen slow, just slightly. And her? She didn't hide it well. Her expression didn't fall, but her fingers tapped the edge of the table now, restless. Her confidence hadn't cracked, but it wasn't smooth anymore either. I opened my folder, slow, intentional. Inside were copies of documents I hadn't wanted to need. Bank statements, tax records, emails, receipts I'd saved for no reason at the time other than some voice in my gut saying, "Keep that." I hadn't wanted to bring any of it. I'd spent months hoping we could resolve this with dignity, that maybe silence would spare us both. But her last move, framing me as reckless, even dangerous, had made one thing clear. She didn't come here for resolution. She came to erase me, so I stopped giving her the benefit of the doubt. The judge requested the court to move forward with scheduling the next phase, full testimony, formal review of both parties' evidence. Dates were read out, schedules compared. It was happening. This was no longer a hearing, it was a reckoning. As the session wrapped, the judge dismissed us with a neutral tone, as if the ground underneath hadn't just shifted again. But I felt it, and so did she. Because when we stood, she looked at me, directly, for the first time in an hour. And it wasn't smugness anymore. It wasn't victory. It was something colder, tighter, confused, like she was trying to figure out how the narrative had started slipping from her hands. I held her gaze. Not for long, just enough to make something clear without saying a word. There'd be no retreat. I had nothing flashy to bring. No monologues, no breakdowns. Just the facts. Just the truth. And I was ready to say it all, on record. She thought she had just cornered me. The judge's gavel hadn't dropped, but something heavier had. The silence after her submission wasn't relief or pause. It was the kind of stillness that arrives just before a storm starts, when people stop talking not because they've run out of words, but because they know what's next won't be easy to hear. The afternoon light, once diffused and soft through the courtroom windows, had sharpened into slanted streaks, cutting the room into patches of gold and shadow. It felt hotter somehow, even though the thermostat hadn't moved. Maybe it was just the weight of eyes, expectations, and the sudden sense that this wasn't just a hearing anymore. It was something closer to judgment. She didn't glance my way now. Her eyes were fixed forward on the judge, not seeking understanding, just approval. Then came the move I should have seen coming. Your Honor. Her attorney stood again, smooth but firm. We'd like to submit an additional folder of materials, including testimonial summaries and supporting affidavits related to Mr. Rowan's previous interactions, financial and interpersonal, that speak to a long-standing pattern. There was a pause, not from the judge, from everyone else. I didn't need to see what was in that folder. I already knew. Photos cropped out of context, emails printed with one paragraph visible and two missing. Comments pulled from years ago, said in frustration or exhaustion, repurposed to look like confession. And worst of all, names of people who'd once called me friend or family, now turned passive witnesses to a story rewritten by omission. She didn't blink as the papers changed hands, didn't fidget. Her mouth was calm, her posture unshaken. That was when I felt it. Not panic, not anger, just the cold understanding that this wasn't about negotiation anymore. This was about burial. She wasn't trying to win custody. She was trying to burn the bridge behind me, salt the earth beneath my feet, and make sure that if I ever tried to tell my side again, it would sound like fiction. I sat still, not because I didn't feel anything, but because I felt too much to move. I'd come into this hearing with a plan, a careful, patient path, one that trusted the truth to rise, slowly but steadily, with the right timing. But I had made a fatal assumption, that she still cared about appearances. Now I saw it clearly. She was done pretending. And if I kept playing by the old rules, I wouldn't just lose. I'd be erased. The judge flipped through the packet quietly. His face didn't change. That was part of his job. But I noticed something different in how he asked his next question, measured, precise. Mr. Rowan, would you like to review the newly submitted material before proceeding? I nodded once. Yes, Your Honor. They passed me a copy. I didn't rush. I didn't need to. Page after page was what I expected. Half-truths dressed as documentation. Patterns drawn from scattered dots, held together by assumption and insinuation. But the moment that hit hardest wasn't the content. It was the realization that I'd been here before, not in this courtroom, but in the dynamic. The rewriting of moments, the selective memory, the punishment of silence. I closed the folder gently and looked down at my own notes, my outline, the careful structure I'd prepared to walk the court through what had happened over the years. Patient, reasoned, non-confrontational. It wasn't enough anymore. The plan had assumed decency, assumed some kind of shared floor we both wouldn't fall beneath, but she just kicked through it. I looked up, not at her, not yet, but at the judge. No questions at this time, I said, but I'll address it fully in my final statement. He nodded again. Nothing dramatic passed between us, but I saw it, the way he shifted slightly in his chair, the way his pen hovered longer than before. He knew this had changed. And her? She leaned back now, one leg crossed over the other, fingertips resting lightly on the edge of the table. Not gloating, just waiting. Like the damage had already been done. And maybe it had. For a moment, only one, I wondered if I should retreat, Change course, avoid what was coming. But that passed quickly, because in that same moment, something clicked into place inside me. I wasn't here to win. Not anymore. I was here to stop the cycle. I wouldn't respond blow for blow. That would make this another shouting match in disguise. I had to show something deeper than rebuttal, so I did nothing, for now. I folded my hands, let my breathing settle, and sat quietly. To anyone watching, it probably looked like I was struggling to keep up, maybe even cracking. But inside, I was lining everything up, because when my time came, I wouldn't swing wildly. I would expose the pattern. Not just her tactics today, but the years of revision, the way truth had been softened, edited, weaponized until it no longer resembled itself. That was the only way forward now. Not to prove I was better, but to make sure no one else got buried under a story they didn't write. The judge looked down at his docket. "We'll move to final statements after a short recess," he said, voice calm but clipped. The bailiff announced the break. I stayed seated as the room began to rustle. Her lawyer leaned over to whisper something. She nodded, but didn't smile. Not yet. And then, finally, she turned to me. It wasn't hatred in her face. It was satisfaction. She truly believed this was it, that she had crushed whatever was left of me in that folder. I held her gaze. No anger, just clarity. She thought this was the moment she finished me. The judge glanced at the clock, then at us, and gave a short nod. "We'll resume with closing clarifications. Mr. Maxwell, you may proceed." Her attorney stood with confidence sharpened by momentum. He was smooth, rehearsed, like someone who believed they had already won and now just had to say the lines right to seal it. "Your Honor," he began, "we rest our case with the submitted documentation and reiterate that the inconsistencies in Mr. Rowan's conduct over the years, when taken together, paint a clear and unavoidable picture of neglect, lack of emotional stability, and poor judgment in matters pertaining to family welfare." A pause, just long enough to let it sting. Then he sat. No fireworks, just a quiet declaration. Final, polished, clean. The judge's eyes turned to me. "Mr. Rowan." I stood, slow and steady, not because I needed time, but because everyone in that room needed a moment to adjust. Expectations hung thick in the air. They were waiting for me to protest, to unravel, to sputter with emotion or cling to character defense. Instead, I reached into my jacket pocket. The room stilled further when I pulled out a small folded piece of paper. It wasn't much, creased down the middle, edges slightly frayed. I laid it gently on the table between us, her table, just a few feet away from where she sat. She didn't react, not visibly, but her fingers twitched against the pen she'd been toying with for the past hour. I looked at the judge, then spoke. Only once. This was never about money. It was always about control. And the truth. That was all. Then I gestured to the paper. The note was written the day she said I abandoned my family financially. You'll find the date matches the transfer receipt in the final document I'm submitting now. I handed the bailiff a thin folder, just 2 pages inside. One was a scanned copy of the note in front of them. The other was the official banking record showing a personal payment of $1,000, delivered directly to her, with a notation for school supplies, rent, and groceries. Use it how you need. The handwriting on the note read simply, "Thanks, Silas. I'll make this stretch. We'll be okay." Signed with her initials, the same woman now claiming I hadn't contributed a dime for 2 years. The judge didn't ask for more. He reviewed the documents in silence. No one in the courtroom moved, I didn't look at her. I didn't need to. Silence did what voices couldn't. Every part of this had been timed, not for drama, but for truth. The room didn't explode. It just shifted. Weight settled where it belonged. Eyes that had skimmed past me all day now paused longer. The people behind us, friends, observers, strangers, began to rearrange their perception. She sat still, but the stiffness in her shoulders wasn't composure anymore. The judge finally spoke, voice low but exact. Given the contradiction between the testimony and this dated exchange, as well as the corroborating evidence, the court finds the previously submitted claim of non-support to be unreliable. We will proceed under the assumption that material misrepresentation may have occurred. The hearing will conclude with this on record. No raised voice, no condemnation, just fact, just wait. Her lawyer shifted in his seat. She blinked, lips parting slightly, but nothing came out. I sat down. The paper, creased and quiet, remained on the table between us. I didn't touch it again. For the first time since these proceedings began, I felt the room looking at me differently, not with pity or curiosity, but something closer to recognition, or maybe understanding. No one clapped. No one nodded. But something changed. She'd built her story on noise, on scattered pieces arranged for impact. But in the end, the truth didn't shout. It just stood there. The judge gave one final glance across the room, then closed the folder with a soft thud that somehow echoed louder than any gavel strike. There was no dramatic dismissal, no verbal declaration of victory or failure, just a quiet, procedural closing that signaled the end. People began rising slowly. No chatter, no applause. No one even looked at me, not out of disrespect, but because moments like this aren't made for celebration. Justice, when it's real, doesn't arrive like thunder. It walks in on flat shoes, says what needs saying, then walks back out. My ex-wife stood with stiff posture as she gathered her documents. She didn't glance in my direction. Not once. Her attorney whispered something to her that she didn't seem to hear. Or maybe she was just too focused on the fact that everything she'd built, layer by layer, had quietly crumbled right in front of her. Not with a bang, but a breath. And yet, I didn't feel triumphant. Just tired. We filed out, row by row, like strangers leaving a church after a sermon that left everyone a little heavier than when they came in. Outside the courtroom doors, the air was cooler, whether from the building's air system or just the sudden change in energy, I couldn't tell. A few people nodded politely as they passed. No one spoke. I walked a few paces down the corridor before pausing near a bench by the wall. I stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle into my bones. That was when she finally looked at me. Just a flicker. Not enough to invite a conversation, only to acknowledge that I still existed in the same space. She stepped closer, adjusted the strap of her bag, and said, "I'll have my assistant email you the remaining forms." I nodded once. All right. That was it. No apology, no justification, no breakdown. And I didn't expect one. I didn't even want one, if I'm honest. Sometimes what people don't say tells you everything. I waited until she walked down the hall, out of view. Only then did I feel the weight in my chest shift. Not disappear, just move. Like something heavy had been relocated but not discarded. Victory doesn't clean the slate. It just ends the argument. Years of being undermined didn't vanish because a ruling tilted in my favor. The hurt lingered, quiet, settled, familiar. Like an old joint injury that doesn't scream anymore but still aches when the rain comes. I stepped outside into the late afternoon light. The sun had dropped low enough to cast long shadows on the sidewalk, and the air smelled faintly of exhaust, coffee, and something fried from a food truck half a block down. A young couple passed by, mid-laugh. A kid chased a pigeon. Life, it turned out, had kept moving, completely untouched by what just unraveled in courtroom 3B. I stood there on the steps for a while, just breathing, the way you do when you come out of a long tunnel and realize you've been holding your breath for miles. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my wallet, slid open the inner fold. There it was, that same old paper, creased, worn, soft around the edges from being handled too many times. Thanks, Silas. I'll make this stretch. We'll be okay. I stared at it for a few seconds longer. Then I walked over to a nearby trash bin, opened the lid, and let it fall. No big gesture, no dramatic sigh, just a man letting go of something he no longer needed to carry. As I walked away, hands in my pockets, I thought about all the things people believe power looks like. Voices raised, doors slammed, dominance, force. But that's not what I learned today. Real power doesn't demand a stage. It doesn't punch down or shout across a room. Real power is choosing the one moment to speak when everything inside you says yell. It's waiting out the noise, calm, certain, and letting truth find its own way to stand. And it's surviving long enough to reach that moment without losing yourself along the way. I turned the corner, leaving the courthouse behind me. No fanfare, no audience, just a man with empty hands and a steady heart. I didn't win because I was louder. I won because I was ready.